Hi, this is William Henderson,
And this is B. McGraw.
and this is the Unjerked podcast. So, what we do is we take things we find on Reddit and Twitter and look into it with a little more depth. So, this episode is going to be talking about local versus national politics, what actually is controlled at each level, if that makes sense. All right, so let's get going. So first, I want to start out with my overall thesis on this topic. So basically, my opinion is that when it comes to people's thoughts on, matters outside of their, immediate life, obviously people have their own lives. They go to kids' soccer practices and go to work and stuff. But outside of that, there's bigger picture issues that people care about. My opinion is that 80% of that effort should be focused on your local community, whether that be local politics or, other local community issues. And the reasons for that, I think local officials have a lot more control over your day-to-day life than you would think. And number two, I think, and this might be a bit out of scope, but I think most of what I think people are designed to live in small communities, and I think there's a certain level of artificiality, I guess, in being obsessed with things that are happening across the entire world. Obviously, you want to care about if there's like a atrocity happening in another part of the world. You want to be plugged into that and be aware of that, but at the same time, you know, humans were not designed to know about every single bad thing that happens in the world every single day. And so I think to affect change in the most effective way, I think you should mostly focus on what's happening at the local level. Do you have anything to say about that?
I'll have a couple thoughts. Yeah, if you cared about like everything going on everywhere, that's like that scene from Bruce Almighty when he starts receiving all of the prayers from everyone everywhere, and it's just like, oh my gosh, information overload. And then also, I just feel like civics education should have, those like draw the line from like the word to the definition things you take on like grade school quizzes. They need to have that for adults where one side is things about your life and on the right will be like the different parts of the government and local government and what actually controls it. So you have to like match it up. I think
I
most
think,
adults would fail that.
yeah, I think in the context of US politics, basically the president specifically is blamed for everything. Like your girlfriend left you, obviously it's the president's fault, you know. I was being a little facetious there, but I think the broader point is there's local politics, there's state politics, and then there's federal politics, and then at each level there's usually multiple branches of government. And then on top of all of that, there's a lot of things that are mostly outside the control of the government. There's a lot of external issues that happen where, obviously, like if there's a huge natural disaster, there's an important government response. You want to have a good natural disaster recovery plan. But the fact that a natural disaster happens in the first place, obviously that's outside the control of the government. I think a lot of economic factors are outside of the control of the government. Um, and so I think way too many people place all the blame on like literally one person.
It's kind of a messiah complex, except the bad part about being the messiah.
Yeah, we should have a national scapegoat, like an actual, because like there were ancient societies where they would like throw all their sins on like a
Oh
goat.
yeah, that was a Jewish tradition, I believe.
Oh, was it?
Scapegoat. Yeah, the
Yeah,
scapegoat was a Jewish thing. Yeah, and they would like kick the goat out of town or something. I can't remember
yeah.
what part of the Bible that's from. The part before
So,
Jesus.
anyways, if you kind of look into the numbers, And I think I know why people don't care about local politics. And the reason is it's boring. And I think when you're talking about global issues or you're talking about, national issues, a lot of times it kind of gives you a sense of grandiosity to feel plugged into what's happening. You know, um, you know, a possible war with a huge country on the other side of the globe. That feels really, really important. But debating whether the town should allow a deli to be built somewhere, not
Yeah,
super interesting.
can't say I have strong opinions about that deli until it's
Yeah,
there.
yeah. So I honestly think it's a very simple explanation. I think a lot of the local issues feel like they're lower stakes. Um, but I think a lot of times they actually have a huge impact on your life. So when we look at voter turnout, so there's this article from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, which is one of those Carnegie funded sort of nonprofits. But they basically, it says visualizing voter turnout in local and school board elections. So they have this graph with the voter turnout for different things, and they go into the numbers a little bit. And they say 66.8% of eligible voters participated in the 2020 presidential election, 50.3% in the 2018 midterm elections, less than 15% for municipal elections,
Ooh.
and 5 to 10% for local school board elections.
I mean,
So,
I don't have kids. I'm not voting in a school board election.
so you do get taxed though for
Oh, that is true.
yeah, you have to pay property tax that funds the schools. So the midterm elections are basically elections where there are federal elections, but there's no president running. So usually it's senatorial elections, House of Representative elections, etc. My understanding is that a lot of times, at least where I live, the local elections happen on odd years. So let's say presidential and midterm elections happen on even years. Where I live, the local elections happen on odd years. I don't know if that's a thing that happens across the country,
Yeah, I don't
but
know.
that's something that I've kind of noticed. So, practically speaking, what this means is, for all intents and purposes, local politics consists of essentially oligarchies that are largely divorced from what people actually care about. And not because there's something nefarious going on. It's mostly because people kind of have collectively decided that they're okay with not having a voice in their local elections. And I'm going to be honest, I was one of those people. I didn't first. Well, I would say the one rule I always followed is if there was an uncontested election, I would not vote for someone because I just think the idea of like voting for someone when no one's running against them just kind of seemed fundamentally silly to me. Um, I would usually vote for senator, representative, and then once it got down to like state houses, it would basically be like 50-50. I would kind of like
Hmm.
look through the brochure. If I felt like okay, this person, I like their policies more than the other person, I would sometimes vote. A lot of times I was like, hey man, I just don't know enough about these people. It feels almost irresponsible to pick one over the other if I
That's
don't know
kind
enough
of how
about
I
them.
feel too. Whenever I'm involved on them, like I did not look any of these people up. And even
Yeah,
when you do, you're like, I don't have an opinion on these issues.
yeah,
But I
and
biked to work the other day, and that's when I started caring about potholes and bike lanes. I start caring.
I also, yeah, I think people start participating when things directly impact them. And so
Yeah.
what you see is a lot of, for example, I think once people have children, they care a lot more about, for example, school boards because they have children who are attending those school boards. Um, once people have houses, they suddenly care about, you know, policy related to their neighborhoods and how will this affect my property value? Which I think is a big reason why there's a lot of zoning related stuff, we talked
Yeah.
about previously. I think
Mm-hmm.
once you have an actual asset whose value, you think would go down, I think in practice that's not the case, but you think will go down, then you start voting accordingly based off of that. And, I think once you have a lot of money, you start getting upset about high taxes because it's like, oh, well, now that I have money, I can get taxed on it. I supported high taxes when I didn't make a lot of money. And now that I make a lot of money, I believe in the dynamism of the free markets, so I think it's a bit simplistic, but I do think people tend to vote for their interests. Yeah. So, I think that explains a lot of it. And I think these patterns, you tend to see them across the globe. I think it varies, certainly. But people, well, there's certain countries where you can't vote at the federal level. But even a lot of those countries, they usually have some, not usually, but sometimes they have voting at the local level. But when you have a country like ours, people care more about the federal elections. And there's a Ballotopedia um, article that talks about uncontested elections. And this is not unique. This is not just local elections. I think this data is also federal elections. But it says in 2024, Ballotopedia or Ballotpedia covered 34,736 elections. And of the total, 75% were uncontested.
Whoa.
Yeah. So
Crazy.
it says 86% of local judge elections were uncontested. And
Wow.
School boards actually have the lowest uncontested rate at 57%. So that's a good thing. It seems like
Yeah.
it's still a high number, but
Mhm.
it shows that people seem to care enough. Yeah, I imagine a lot of a lot of parents would also run for school board positions.
Reminds me, once when I was in high school, you know how they had like the student government, whatever. There was one year that nobody in my class ran for anything, and they all made us get into a room and said, someone has to do this job. And one guy said, I guess I'll do it.
It is quite interesting that I think it probably depends on the state, but I think most local judicial positions are elected positions. Um, it seems a bit odd to me. I just feel like a judge is somebody who there should be a more deliberate process rather than popular votes.
Yeah.
And in fact, these are often uncontested elections. So some random person's like, I want to be the judge, and he just becomes the judge.
Sure. Here you go.
Yeah. So yeah, it's a high number, and now there's a other article that I'd like to talk about. And it says, mind the gap, please, pinpointing the influence of municipal size on local electoral participation. Written by Adam Genswill at the Department of Local Policy and Local Development and Policy at the University of Warsaw. So this paper basically says turnout rates vary between local and national elections. This paper promotes the national-local turnout gap as the best way to pinpoint the local component of voting at local elections. And it basically says there's a clear, and I don't know if this is like Poland only or if this applies across the world. But it basically says that there's a demonstrated and clear, consistent relationship between municipal size and local turnout of voting. So basically, the larger the municipality, the fewer eligible voters turn out at local elections compared to
That's
national
interesting.
elections. Yeah, it's quite interesting. So the smaller a town is, the more people are participating in the politics. So if there's a big city like LA or New York, as examples I just came up with, fewer people actually take part. That's kind of what the participation looks like. In practice, a lot of people who run for local politics, a lot of I think a lot of the people who support local politicians when it comes to funding, I would say are kind of the local big shots in terms of financial resources. So that would be, um, local chambers of commerce, car dealers. Uh, in fact, a lot of wealthy people in the country are owners of car dealerships. Um, Local developers, those types of people, oftentimes are big funders of local politicians. So why
I'd buy that.
does local politics matter? We already talked. Well, we will. So in terms of why local politics matters, so there's two reasons. So one we'll talk about later is that a lot of policy is set at the local level, and another reason it matters is local politics is a huge pipeline into federal politics. So a lot of people will say, basically like, hey, I'm not going to vote for president because I don't like my choices. And people will say, well, how come the choices are so bad for president or for senator or whatever? And the reality is, like, there's a pipeline that exists for these positions, and a big chunk of that pipeline comes from local, bodies of government. And so there's a Congressional Research Service paper on the membership of the 118th Congress. So they basically look at, what did these people do before they joined Congress? And so there's a couple examples. So if you're looking at both houses of Congress, that's 500 and something people, I'm guessing. So 41 of them were former mayors. 13 of them were former governors. 6 former attorney generals, state attorney generals, um, 264 former state or territorial legislatures or legislators. And so almost half of people in the US Congress previously served in local state houses, basically. Um, and there's a couple of other examples, but essentially, over half probably of people who are in the US Congress had some sort of position at lower levels of government. In fact, the former state or territorial legislators, that's the biggest category of job, basically. The second biggest was former congressional staff, or no, former educators was second with 101. And then after that was former congressional staffers at 77. In practice, there's a lot of lawyers, but I think that kind of gets subsumed into, it says 132 members of the House hold law degrees. Maybe not all practicing lawyers, but obviously there's a huge, overrepresentation of lawyers in Congress. But in terms of previous work experience, by far the biggest is being a part of a state house. And then if you delve deeper, like, where do people, when people get elected to state houses, what did they do before that? And you kind of see the same effect, where a lot of people who were part of city councils and things like that. So when you look at, the presidents of the United States, or you look at the governors and the senators, a lot of them started out as mayors or, city council members, or they were, the local representative for the state senate, things like that. They they were school board. They were basically the head of the school board, or maybe they were a police chief or a sheriff or something like that. So that is one reason why it matters. I think the second reason that I mentioned is that a lot of policy is made at lower levels of government. And so there's some background in terms of the constitutional basis for this. So we're going to kind of look into that a little bit. So there's a couple relevant parts of the Constitution that talk about this. So the 10th Amendment of the Constitution says the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So essentially they're saying, if there's something that's not explicitly given to the federal government as a power by the Constitution, or somehow derived from that in the U.S. Code, then that power is given to the states or to the people. And then the Supremacy Clause, Article 6, Clause 2, basically says This Constitution and the laws of the U.S. which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the U.S. shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. So the basically one of the interpretations that have been upheld by the courts of this clause essentially is that if state and federal law contradict each other, then federal law supersedes state law. I think it makes sense. I don't think you could really run a country if this wasn't the case. So these are kind of the two legal frameworks for, who has what power. And so, and then one more interesting thing, in fact, is what is the role of municipal governments, right? Like a, city government or a county government, what role do they have in the U.S. Constitution? In fact, they basically don't have any expressed power under the U.S. Constitution. The authority that local governments have is entirely within the purview of the state governments, which I found very interesting. Basically,
that is kind of interesting.
Basically, local, city governments, county governments only exist because state governments allow them to be. Basically, which is kind of the opposite. Like, I'm pretty sure, like I don't think the federal government could just unilaterally disband a state. Like, I don't think that's really a thing.
Yeah.
Like they can't just declare like California no longer exists. I think that's not really a thing. But when it comes to local governments, they mostly exist because the states allow them to. There's more nuance to it. There's two different things. There's this thing called Dillon's rule, and then there's also the concept of home rule. So basically, when you look at what the difference is between the two. So according to this article from Brookings, it says Dillon's rule is a strict interpretation of state laws that allows localities to possess only such powers as are specifically delegated to them by state law. So basically, Dillon's rule happens when a state says, "Hey, you only have the powers that we explicitly allow you to have."
Wow.
And there's another thing called home rule, which essentially is where the state's constitution grants municipalities or counties to pass various types of laws to govern themselves. So two similar but different concepts. So Dillon's rule basically says that local governments can only do things that the state specifically says they're allowed to do. If Dillon's rule does not apply, that means local governments basically have flexibility to say, "Hey, I think this is something we should be able to do." And then home rule is a matter of laws. So if a state allows home rule, that means local governments can create laws. If a state does not allow home rule, then local governments cannot create laws. So they can if they don't have home rule, they can administer an area, they can run services, things like that, but they can't actually pass laws, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I've never thought of it like that, and I didn't know it was such a patchwork. That's interesting.
Yeah, and so that kind of creates four different categories, or multiple different categories, I guess 5 different categories of what kind of governments you can have, and essentially there's no clear pattern. It's not like the South is all this way and the North is all this way. It's kind of a mishmash.
Yeah,
Basically,
it really is.
But basically, if you have a very strict state where Dillon's rule applies and there's no home rule, then that means local governments are not allowed to pass laws, and they're only allowed to do things the state says they can do. If a state has neither, so if a state does not have Dillon's rule and a state allows home rule, then a local government can create its own laws, and also it has the ability to kind of decide, "Hey, I think this is something we can make decisions on." And so they're not constrained by what's specifically granted to them. So again, it's a mishmash. There's no obvious trends in terms of what parts of this country are what way, etc.
Hmm.
So that's kind of the legal framework of what, local, state, federal power is essentially.
Hmm.
So let's kind of go into, what each side controls. I don't have like citations on most of these because I think a lot of this is kind of common knowledge. This is kind of like general knowledge. But basically, at the local and state level, at the municipal and state level, you have, most transportation related stuff, law enforcement, interestingly. In fact, okay, this is the one where I do have a citation because I think it's important. But if you go to, there's this sort of advocacy group called Prison Policy, and they're sort of opposed to mass incarceration. And this is a separate episode we need to do. But they actually talk about like, okay, where, but they basically are like, okay, well, where are all the prisoners in our country? And 90% of the prisoners are in local and state institutions.
Mm-hmm.
So the federal prison system is actually a very small percentage of the imprisoned population. In fact, approximately 1/4 of all people who are incarcerated are not convicted. They're people awaiting trial or sentencing. Actually, not even sentencing. They're awaiting trial at a local jail. So 1/4 of people who are incarcerated have not gotten to trial, which is insane.
Yep. Wow.
To think about.
Isn't that like a amendment on the Bill of Rights there? A speedy trial?
Well, the theory is that you should have a speedy trial, but it is suspect when 1/4 of all people who are incarcerated have not gone to trial. But that's largely because of state and local policies, So transportation, law enforcement, healthcare. Healthcare, a lot of the money comes from the federal government, but the implementation, a lot of it's at the local level, most of it, in fact. Zoning and urban design, certain entitlement programs, education, utilities, elections. So actual running of elections is done at the state level.
Oh, a lot of talk about that this year.
Yeah. And licensing for a lot of different jobs is done at the state and local level, probably the state level. And a lot of I think the federal government, these are very important things. I think a lot of them are things that don't really determine elections. For example, the national security and international relations world, State Department, defense, intelligence, customs, commerce, international commerce. So basically, international relations, national security, that's all done at the federal level. Doesn't usually influence elections. Entitlement programs, the big ones are done at the federal level. Social Security, Medicare. Medicaid is funded by the federal government, but largely administered by state governments. And then Veterans Affairs. Immigration, this one certainly is a big election issue.
That is a big one.
Immigration is controlled by the federal government. Monetary policy, I would say some people care about for elections, but it's controlled independently of the political system. It's controlled by the Federal Reserve, which is, a quasi-federal entity. It's technically a collection of banks that own the Federal Reserve. But
have we done an episode on the Fed yet?
We have not.
We ought to.
But yeah. So technically, the regional Federal Reserve banks are owned by like a consortium of banks, but the actual chairman of the Federal Reserve is appointed by the president. So it's a weird sort of part of the government, but not really type thing. Anything interstate commerce, IP and bankruptcy law, the post office. If there's a travel component that's interstate, like air travel, things like Amtrak, highway transportation laws, that's all controlled by the federal government. Largely not something that influences elections. Federal law enforcement, so a lot of civil rights laws, antitrust laws, and then certain federal agencies like the ATF, DEA, FBI, the Marshal Service, that's all federal. And then a lot of federal R&D is almost entirely on the government side funded by the federal government. Defense,
Yeah.
energy, NIH, NSF. We did an episode on that. And then there's some support of local government functions through, housing for, HUD, student loans through education, but that's largely a financing arm. It's not really, implementation. A lot of that is financing state governments. And then there's like miscellaneous other things like conservation, agriculture, collecting economic data, federal labor laws, public health, etc. So, that's very important things, but I think most of these are not really election topics. Nobody cares about R&D, really. I mean, people, scientists do, but the average voter doesn't care about R&D. The average voter does not care about national security issues, foreign policy issues. The average voter, they might care a little bit about interest rates. So I do think that's
people
a big
care about
election
interest
issue.
rates.
Yeah, they do. But people don't care a ton about conservation. Again, people say they do, but I think most people don't. At least not enough to influence their voting decisions. So a lot of federal policy really is technocratic stuff that most people are not paying attention to. The big ones that people do pay attention to, I think immigration obviously is the big one.
That is a huge one this year.
The main entitlement program, Social Security, Medicare, people care a lot about. But when people complain about their grievances, it's cost of education, cost of housing, crime in their neighborhoods. Most of those things are controlled by the local level. I think the one exception, the cost of higher ed, a lot of that, we did an episode on that. I think that's largely because of federal student loans, essentially distorting the pricing, or distorting price signals. So I do think that's a federal issue, largely, although most colleges are actually controlled and or partially funded by state governments. But when you're talking about crime, that's mostly a local issue. There's not much the federal government can really do to affect crime rates in different places.
Not really.
When you're talking about utilities, why are my utility bills going up? Your utilities are usually controlled or regulated by your state and local government. When you're talking about, the cost of healthcare, a lot of the healthcare decisions, there's certain states require, and we need to do a healthcare episode too. I keep saying this for every topic, but basically, there's a certificate of need thing in a lot of states where you're not allowed to build a hospital until the state officially says, oh, we certify that this city needs healthcare. If we dig deeper into where does the money go, where do people, government workers, how many are there at each level? It gets quite interesting. And, I think this is something no one has an intuitive pulse on. If you ask somebody, are there more local or federal employees? It's nobody really thinks about that. But basically, this data comes from the census, U.S. Census of, there's this article that says Census of Governments, Survey of Public Employment and Payroll, Summary Report 2022. And then there's an article, a page from the Congressional Budget Office, federal personnel. So that's where I got this data from. But basically, at the municipal level, there's 14 million employees, 1-4. At the state level, there's 5.3 million employees, and at the federal level, there's 4.5 million employees. So in fact, there are far more city employees than there are even the other two combined. And there's more state employees than there are federal employees. Frankly, I'm guessing a lot of the city employees are things like teachers and cops and things like that. When it comes to the federal employees, like I said, there's 4.5 million. So 1.5 of those are active military personnel. 1 million are reservists who are, technically they're government employees, but they also usually have other jobs. So, it's, I guess, part-time. federal employee. And then 1.35 million civilians in the sort of defense, veterans affairs, homeland security space. And then 0.9 million civilian federal employees who are not in the sort of security related agencies.
It's pretty significant.
Yeah, so when you look at the actual workforce, clearly most federal employees are in the sort of military/homeland security space. That's where most of it is.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone else is 900 million. So government workers, it's mostly city employees and state employees and military. And when you're talking about, the feds, that's basically everybody else. It's 900,000. It's not a big number. When it comes to spending, this is also quite interesting. At the federal level, so when we're talking about expenditures, so the federal government does spend a lot more money than local and state governments. So I got data from the Urban Institute. They have an article on state and local expenditures. And then the federal government data I got from the Congressional Budget Office. They have a federal budget in fiscal year 2021. And then the Cato Institute has an article on how the federal government spends $6.7 trillion. So that's where I got the data. Yeah, municipal governments spent $1.9 trillion in 2021. State governments spent $1.8 trillion, and the federal government spent $6.8 trillion. And about 17% of that money went to state governments. So it's transferred, basically, leaving a net amount of $5.92 trillion.
To the federal government.
So the federal government does spend a lot more money. I think a big part of that, I think there's two big federal entitlement programs, Social Security and Medicare, that obviously take up a huge part of the budget and explain a lot of that. Also, defense spending that's done at the federal level. So for those reasons, there's a huge amount of spending at the federal level. There's a joke people say that the federal government is basically an insurance program with an army attached to it.
That's a good joke.
Yeah. So it's actually quite interesting when you look at what, federal or what state governments spend their money on. So state and local direct general expenditures, 23% is public welfare. And public welfare is basically Medicaid, temporary assistance for needy families, and supplemental security income, SSI. Those are all actually part of, those are like federal programs that are administered by the state, I think, largely. There is a series of most of these come from either the New Deal or the sort of Great Society so the New Deal was under FDR. And then I think it was the Great Society, I think was under LBJ. Yeah. So a lot of those programs come from that era. So 23% is that. 20.5% is elementary and secondary education. About 10% is health and hospitals. 8.5% is higher education, which is universities and probably community colleges. 5.6% is highways and roads. 3.7% is police. 2.4% is corrections. 1.8% is housing and community development, and 1.4% is courts. So that was episode 1 of our episode on local politics. We'll go to episode 2 next time.